Welcome to the second studio design and architecture show hosted by two architects, myself, David Lee, and Marina Bourderonnet. This week, it's just the two of us in a design companion episode, and we're discussing what?
We're going to talk about the client and architect relationship.
Yes, we are. And specifically, that relationship before and at the very beginning of an architecture project. So we're going to cover some questions, right? Questions like, why should I hire an architect? Do I need to hire an architect? Can I just hire a builder to do the job? Can I just hire an interior designer to do the job? When should I hire an architect? What can I expect in that kind of process? How important is it that I find the right one for me? Or can I find, any decent generic designer? Is that going to suit my needs? Things like this, right? And we're also going to cover some of the common scenarios that take place in architecture and building projects that can cause some frustration between clients and architects. And those issues are related to the beginning of the project. So the kind of beginning phase is what we're going to talk about with the relationship.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a topic that sometimes kind of not really, people don't pay so much attention to. But we found it crucial in the success of any project. So we figured a little episode about it would probably,
Okay, Marina. So let's say that I'm a client and I have this project I want to do on a building I want to create. Let's say it could be anything, but let's say it's a home. Okay. My first question is, do I need an architect for the scope of work that I'm doing? Right? This would be the first question a lot of people might ask themselves.
Yeah, and it should be the first question. And I think people should first think about hiring an architect before they don't think about that.
Right. But I will say, interestingly, a lot of people, that's not the first thing they think about.
No, and I feel like a lot of them think that architects maybe do bigger projects and therefore they won't do a home, or that because, it's only interiors, like you wouldn't use an architect. Like there's different ways why people don't think about hiring an architect for a new home or a home remodel.
So I would say, kind of summarizing everything before we go through everything, is that I think one of the big key takeaways from this is that architects are much more, do a lot more different things than people think.
Yeah.
So anything in the design and building sphere, an architect is probably going to be able to help you out significantly in that space.
I feel like people think that architects means very technical and complicated things.
Right.
And if your project is fairly simple on the design and building aspect of it, therefore you don't need one. Right. And I think that's kind of a big misunderstanding of what we do as architects.
So let's talk about the ones that we've seen, the professionals that get hired in place of an architect that I see. The first one, let's say, is an interior designer, right?
Yes. And
so my project, right, can I just use an interior designer and not use an architect for what I'm doing?
So again, it goes back to what are you trying to do? What is the scope of work? What is the amount of work and things you need to be designed and built, right? If you're just changing the tile of an existing bathroom, you could go with an interior designer. These people know how to select materials and work colors and all of this kind of finishes, right? If you're looking to reconfigure a floor plan so it makes more sense flow-wise, let's say, right, spatially, they might be well versed, or they might not very well be versed into those things.
So first of all, like legally, there's a difference between interior designer and architect as titles, as licensed professionals. They're different licenses, they're different professionals, right? So if a project is large enough where it requires an architect legally, then obviously you need an architect. If a project is of a smaller scope and you're not doing certain things, you're not touching the exterior, you're not doing X, Y, and Z, then you can use an interior designer. But interior designers, by definition, legally, they're not allowed to do certain things.
Yeah, and I mean, same thing with the builder. Like you can build a house without using an architect and just have the builder do everything. So the first question is, what is the scope of work you're trying to do?
Right.
And then who is the best person to do what you're looking to do?
Right.
And then which person is by law required for you to hire to do what you're looking to do?
Right. So what are some of the what are some of the things that interior designers cannot do and therefore you would need an architect?
Anything that's touching the exterior of an existing building, they're called interior designers and not exterior designers for some reason, right? As soon as you start touching the building envelope, could be the roof, it could be, even moving
Exterior
a window, someone
windows.
will have to take that liability on. And it could be a builder, it could be an architect, sometimes it could even be an engineer, but interior designer have a very limited liability.
What about if I'm just modifying the interior of the building and I'm moving some walls around, but I'm not touching the outside?
Well, it depends. Are they bearing walls? Are there freestanding partitions? If you're moving bearing walls, someone will have to design
bearing walls, meaning
supporting walls, like structural walls,
right?
Walls that if you take it down, the house collapse, right? They're not just they're not divisions between spaces. They're more than that. They're the bones of the house.
And a lot of people don't know this, but this is pretty fundamental. Is that we can categorize all walls into two categories. There's structural walls and load bearing or bearing walls, and then there are walls that are partitions essentially. And those are freestanding. They don't support the building in any way. They're just there to divide space. And a lot of times for clients, when they're in a home, they can't tell what's what. They all look like walls. They're finished the same way. An architect, engineer, contractor, even interior designer will be able to go into a home and say, that's probably a load bearing wall. Let's not touch that. And let's not touch that because it's going to cost more money, or let's not touch that because I can't.
Because I can't, or it might be that, if we do touch that bearing wall, I'm the designer, I will have to be the person talking to the structural engineer and understand how that system works and how that could work with my design. And this becomes this, kind of coordination item between two parties. And oftentimes interior designers, they don't really want to have to deal with that stuff because it's not really in their realm of knowledge or experience.
Right. And that's not a diss in any way.
No,
that's just the nature of things a lot of times. There are for sure interior designers that are well versed in many different things, but it's a little less common. Like the role of the architect, you should go back and listen to the what would be titled, What Does an Architect Do recording? Right. The architect does a lot of different things, and one of the big ones is coordinate with a lot of different people. So that's our comfort zone. It's not always fun, but that's what we do professionally, and especially with people like engineers.
Well, it's our comfort zone, but it's also things we've been a little bit trained into.
Yeah.
Like we learn structural system, forces, how the different loads work around. And interior designers, they don't learn those things.
I think it's really about understanding the scope of work and the legalities of the specific district, town, whatever place that you're in, because it varies from place to place. And based on that, you will require an architect or not, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so for larger size projects, you're very much likely going to need an architect, and you probably won't be able to use just an interior designer for that. Obviously, you can pair the two together if you wanted to.
Yeah, and I think it's they could both be very skilled at design, but the architect will have that coordination layer and skill and experience to be able to, discuss and manage and work with the rest of the building team if it's getting complicated. Otherwise, you're really relying on your builder to resolve things, and it's a lot more pressure on the builder to do things that they're not necessarily there to be doing.
And I do want to talk about hiring just a contractor or a builder and not even using an architect,
right.
But we'll get to that in a moment. Quickly, on the subject of interior design and architecture, or interior designers and architects, it is interesting because we've talked about before in the show that delineation between the two professions seems really silly to us, right? And in particular because we do both services, but I think objectively it's silly, full stop.
It's weird.
Because both of these professions are about the designing and then the creating of spaces and environments, whether that environment be a home, whether it be a exterior city block, whether it be an office building or a gym or anything else, right? And it always seems odd to me that we would chop up these parts of these spaces and say, okay, you're an expert in this one part, you do that part, and you do this other part. It's odd to me because it can lead to a incoherency in the experience of a space.
But it's like you're building a birthday cake. Then you hire the architect to do the outside, and you hire the interior designer to do the inside of the cake. Well, what if the cake tastes like meat but looks like strawberry? Like that would be a good match, you know? It is a weird thing to kind of separate that one object into like a interior, like exterior thing.
Rachel's trifle. Okay. Yeah, and I think that I think a lot of times having a really good team where you pair an interior designer and an architect can be like really, really good.
Yeah.
I will say though that if you're a client, you need to think about what these people's, the architect and the interior designer, what their MO is and what their professional expertise is and what they're allowed to do. In other words, if you come to a interior designer with a problem, the problem being I have this house, it's crap, I need to fix it and make it better. I'm not quite sure how to make it better. I have unlimited budget, we can do anything we want. Tell me how to fix this, right? An interior designer, because their work of scope is always fixed and smaller than what an architect can do, an interior designer is much more likely to say, let's stay within this scope because that's what I can offer you.
That's what they're comfortable is.
Right. Versus someone who is able to do anything will look at the problem with the full vision and say, okay, this is the root of the problem, right?
Right.
I don't care that it's not within the scope of interior design because why would I care about that? I'm an architect. I don't care if it bleeds into the landscape because I'm fine with working with a landscape architect, or I know a little bit about that. So there is this little bit of like when you go to see a specialist for a problem, right? My shoulder hurts and you're going to see a surgeon, you need surgery. Well, why are they saying that? Maybe because you do need surgery, but maybe because that's what they do.
That's
right?
what they do. It's interesting, you know, we said this episode would be talking about the client and architect relationship, but, you know, it's also the relationship between the team members, you know, slightly just on this note. Like if you hire an architect and whatever reason you decided to hire an architect and you do want to hire a separate interior designer, which happens very often, sometimes I think like sometimes it's better to ask that architect if they do have an interior designer they've been used to work with, because the relationship between the two is very important. If a client find an interior designer that they like and find an architect that they like and try to like marry these people on the project and hope that it works, well, it might or it might not, because they might each try to fight for their own portion of the cake they're working on without necessarily wanting to mergely work together to make the cake happen.
Yeah, and there's a few, I think we will get into the team discussion maybe more in a separate thing, but there are ways to make sure that the team dynamic is a productive one, but that marrying, it's a good way to put it because, you know, if you think about if anyone listening has ever tried to do a project with their spouse and they're not designers, so clients who have done a remodel in the past with their husband and wife or their partner, right? They come out at the end and they're happy with the product a lot of times, but they're also like, oh, that was so difficult. And they tell their friends, you have no idea what you're getting into. It's because in those cases, you have two people who don't know really much about this profession and this skill, this craft, this expertise, and they're trying to make decisions about it, right? And it can be very confrontational. It's not easy. It's sort of similar when you have different designers from different offices working on the same project. Designers are very, let's say passionate people about what they do, and they're very opinionated, right? And for good reason, because this is their life. And getting different designers to collaborate really successfully can be an issue, but I think that, like as you said, just making sure that pairing is open and honest from the beginning and everyone's on the same page, and having, if the first person was hired was an architect, consult the architect first. The first person was an interior designer, then you want to make sure the pairing is good, because if it's not a good fit, even if they're really good designers, it might not work out.
Yeah, and again, it's not like, you know, in a home, the architecture stops here and the interior design starts here.
No.
There is no physical boundaries. There is windows and inside and outside. Okay, that's probably the only one. But within the interior of a home, there is architectural parts of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you have basically two people who need to work on the same space, on the same things, you got to make sure that relationship works well.
And going briefly back to my surgeon example, I also want to say it's not. I'm not saying that interior designers or architects or any other building professionals are going to suggest that you do a certain type of work or scope of work or suggest a certain solution because it benefits them. That does happen, but it's not just because I don't say that. Give that example just because of that. I give that example because it's about what that professional can see. Right. Certain people are trained to see certain things. Engineers are trained to understand structure. They can go into a building most often and visualize and with X-ray vision and say, this is probably what's happening. There's probably a column, probably a girder, a beam. There's probably this or that. There's probably a giant truss or whatever it is. Contractors are trained to see a certain thing. Interior designers are trained to see, again, because of their scope, to see certain things, to see their vision is a certain kind of width, let's say. The architect is a unique person because we're the one that's kind of orchestrating and coordinating in a way all the different people. So very quickly, the kind of team diagram is client and then architect, and there's a line of communication between those two, and then from the architect, everyone else, right?
Right.
So everyone else pretty much funnels more or less through the architect to the client, and as a result of that. Not all projects function this way, but most often they do, and they should. Because of that, the architect is the one who has the ability to kind of see a problem for what it truly is, if that makes sense, and then prescribe a solution that makes sense for whatever the situation, rather than saying, I'm only seeing this portion, therefore the solution has to be only a structural one, or only interior design one, or only decorating one, or only whatever. Or I'm a facade designer, whatever, that's what I do. Or you got to fix the facade. You need someone who has that broad vision so they can actually tell you, actually, this other thing is what you should do.
I like the analogy of like a surgeon. And, I probably would say that the architect is like your primary doctor, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's like the first person you go to if you have a question or if you need guidance onto who to see next for what you need. Like they're your advisor. They have a better understanding of, all of the people out there that can do things for you.
The last thing I'm going to say with this discussion of interior versus architecture is that I think that most architects are more adept at interior design than most clients and the general public think. That's almost a fact at this point. And so the difference between the two is more like if there's a circle and that circle represents the entirety of a project, every single bit of the project, the architect should have knowledge about everything within that circle, right? And interior design is only at the very center, let's say, of the circle. It's a small portion of it, and that's the scope that an interior designer is really an expert at, right? So an architect. Most architects are skilled at doing interior design. Interior designers not skilled at doing architecture. It's not a diss, but it's just because of what the professions are. That's how it works.
Well,
I would never hire an interior designer to design the exterior of my building. It's a different design skill set in a lot of ways.
It goes back to being a specialist. Like you go see a surgeon or you go see an orthodontist, and not an implant dentist, to put the teeth back straight. Like, those professions are very focused onto one thing, or focused onto one thing to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Beyond that extent, they don't know.
And there are definitely architects out there who specialize in only certain things. Like there's some architects, I only do the exterior, I don't touch the interior.
Yeah,
they exist. Okay, that's fine. If they want to do that, fine. If you find them and it works out great, fine. But personally, I think it's wackadoo.
Oh, and a lot of offices, medium-sized to large size, would have an interior design department within them.
Yeah.
So it's not because it says architecture office on their business card or their website or, their front door, that's the only thing they do. Like a lot of them, there is at least one person that has experience or is an interior designer. And I wouldn't say to me it's the best, but I would probably trust an office that does that more on getting a successful project than pairing different businesses if it's the first time they work together, right?
I see.
Or if I want my project to feel very seamless you know, from inside and out, from the decorating to the design of the volumes, you know, like I would rather have someone in-house to do that with the rest of the team that does the other things than, you know, have people each work on their own thing and try to like.
I mean, look, I think that's fair. I think on the face of it, right, there's certainly less risk in certain ways. Although again, you can have collaborations that are super productive and really cool.
And then, you know, the last part is the decorating portion.
Yeah.
You know, like an architecture office could also do interior design, but maybe you really like this decorator you found on Instagram or a blog online. And that's another layer of the project that could more easily play well with whatever was designed, you know, than maybe, you know, other ones.
Yeah, and this goes back also to what are we as design professionals trying to do? We're trying to create beautiful, happy, whatever spaces and environments. And by that definition, because that's what you experience is the whole environment, there's no delineation between this or that thing. You know, it's very silly to say like, I'm going to design the ceiling. You design the wall, I'll design the pillow, and you design the rug, and we all come together and see if it like works out, you know. It's not like that. And yeah, so back to what you said a moment ago, the bleeding of interior and exterior. Obviously there's an exterior and obviously there's an interior for protection, but in terms of design and experience from the client, from the client's perspective, there's no separation. There's no separation, which is why you'll find a lot of architects are more skilled at interior design than many think, and a lot of architects are actually really good interior designers if they offer that service, because it's within our scope. Now, the other professional that comes up really often, the one that you would use instead of an architect, is a builder or a contractor. We hear about this incredibly often, which is I have this project. The first person everyone thinks about, it seems like a lot of times, is a builder.
Well, it's the guy who's going to make it happen.
Yeah.
The guy who makes it real, right? And you know, I think it makes sense from like the client perspective. Like you have kind of a rough idea of what you want to do with, let's say, your house, right? You just need the muscle and the manpower to do it. So the first person that comes to mind is the guy who does the job, the guy who's on site building your room and your bathroom and your stuff, right?
And I guess in that mindset, if I'm talking as a client, I kind of assume that the builder's done this 100 times before. So if I tell him, well, I'm thinking, you know, some kind of white cabinetry over there, and I want this other room to be added here, they can sort out, that's enough for them to go off of. Like they can figure out the rest because they've done it before.
They've done it before, they're experienced, they do that every day, that's their job. And I think that's kind of where the lack of knowledge comes from a lot of clients about the building process, is that before building, you have a thinking process, which is also the design process. If you want to do something kind of interesting, right? Not just rudimentary. And you might have a very rough idea in your head of what you want, but how do you clearly communicate that idea to the guy who's going to build it? You have no drawings, you only have words, and you're trying to describe it. And this person's supposed to understand exactly what you have in your head and telling you if it's the best way to do it, if there's another way to do it, if it's the most cost-efficient way to do it, right?
Yeah. You're right that there's two kind of steps to the process. I mean, an analogy would be that I want this concert to be performed, right? This concert to be executed, right? And this is similar to building. And I'm going to go talk to the musicians or the orchestra and say, okay, I'm going to create this concert. Can you do this concert for me? And they're going to say, right, but what are we playing?
Right.
Well, I did something kind of romantic. It's going to last maybe 10 minutes long. And the next piece I'd want to be like a little more jazzy-ish, you know, maybe with like a little improv section. And I want that kind of credenza thing. And then it's going to end. And then the okay musicians go. Unless we're talking about freeform jazz, the musicians are going to be like, right, but who is writing the music? Where's the music? And who's conducting us when we're performing? Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, architecture is not an improvisation art form.
I wouldn't recommend it.
I mean, you could try it.
It's like jazz, man. Let's just see what happens.
But like, well, and also, and one reason for that is that we are not as flexible with the control we have of the elements we're dealing with, right?
No,
you're dealing with a musical instrument. Your body is powering that instrument to make a sound.
Yeah, but also it's a temporary event. I mean, like,
and it's immaterial, right?
When the building's finished, it's going to be there, and they're planned to be there for the next 50, 100 years, and they cost a ton of money.
And you don't want to be for many years.
Improvising should be minimized in a construction project. But so it's similar in a way, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that kind of analogy, my initial thought was the architect is more like the composer. They write the plans, the blueprint for the musicians to perform off. We draw the blueprint from which the builders build from, right? It's the same thing.
And from the builder point of view, like sometimes our clients ask like, oh, what do you do so many drawings? And we're like, well, you can figure it out with drawings, or you can figure it out by you just building stuff on site and taking it down and doing it again and again and again. But it's not going to help the time you spend on this project. It's not going to help the money that you spend on this project. No. So let us take care of that, and then you build it after we figure it out, basically. Yeah,
and so we should maybe kind of go a few steps back and say, legally, whether or not you need a contractor or an architect, similar to what we did for the interior designer. There are plenty of projects in the United States where you can just use a contractor, and legally speaking, you do not need to hire an architect, especially in the residential sector for like freestanding single-family homes. You can build pretty sizable homes with just a contractor. I mean, like really sizable homes with just a contractor and not an architect. But obviously with much larger structures beyond just houses, then architect is necessary. So yeah, it's true that legally there are cases where you can just use a contractor. But I think the things that we're talking about is more about skill set and expertise and the value that each of these bring to the table. And they bring different values, right? Or offer different value. The contractor knows stuff the architect does not know, and the architect knows stuff the contractor also does not know. I think for the sake of this conversation, kind of separating the design and planning portion from the building and execution and construction portion is helpful. And it's kind of like, well, first, the architect is clearly the expert in the design and the planning portion, right? Compared to what the contractor is an expert in. I think that it's important for people to understand that, you can have the best contractor in the world, but if you don't have a good design and good plans to build from, it doesn't really matter, does it?
So what if I'm trying to do my house and I found this design build, this contractor who also does design? Yeah. Like, can I just go with them?
Legally, most likely you can, and you have the option to. For design build, we could probably do a whole recording on design build. For design build, I will say that from what we've seen in our experience through other colleagues and stuff, that if a design build office is led by an architect, it's probably pretty good. If a design build office was founded and is mainly run and led by a contractor, I'm much more skeptical of that, right?
And that's because of a few things, right?
That sounds sounds pretentious, but
there is good and bad in both camps. Like, we're not, generalizing too much, but from our experience with what we've been exposed to with these types of businesses, architecture office who started as architecture office and eventually expanded to design build, oftentimes it's because they do have the design expertise, but they're lacking the knowledge of pricing, or they want more flexibility in-house to achieve the design that they're trying to do.
Or more control over the construction quality.
Control over the construction quality, the construction cost, the construction schedules, and even sometimes just, even teaming with a builder in-house to come up with solutions that are more innovative and enhance the design.
It's the same thing as like some architecture offices, not many, will have a couple engineers in-house.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because there's a difference between the design and the planning and the execution. And architects are knowledgeable about all of it, but they're really experts about the designing portion. Yeah. And so our weakness generally is the execution part. Yeah. That's obviously why we hire engineers. That's why we hire contractors and hire build and all these other people, and we coordinate with them to make sure it gets done correctly. So yeah, we're gonna like kind of tack on and have these people in-house. But think about it this way. You know, an architect who has an engineer in-house, no problem, fine. You want to create the structure, it spans a certain distance, how big should this beam be? Well, I got my engineer in-house, is going to do it for me. Think about the inverse, though. Are you going to hire an engineer who has a couple architects in-house to design your home?
Yeah, like, so that's the thing,
kind of
right? Like
risky.
The architecture office that move into design build, they're clearly people who are passionate about design, and they want to just push it as far as they can. That's pretty much why they went to design build. The general contractors who eventually is branding the business as design build, they might have a draftsman in-house, like a freelancer or a young kid who come out of architecture school to do some CAD drawings and some quick 3D stuff, but that's not their original expertise. The original expertise is building. So if they have someone in-house, it's kind of accessory at this point. Like you would rarely find, like 30-year-old of experienced architects working in those offices.
Yeah, no.
Because it sucks, but at least in California and what we've been exposed to, oftentimes they do that to market themselves as designers and get more projects.
I think you're totally right. It's like really important for clients to really ask, if you're going a design build route, or actually any route, like, okay, who is designing this thing? How much experience have they? Can I meet them? Like whatever, because you're totally right. A lot of the design build in quotes firms and offices we found, it's more like, okay, know your build with a little sprinkle of design, maybe, right? More like drafting in a lot of cases.
And I would say, maybe in like bigger cities, those don't happen so much, but more on like the suburban, at least again in California, there is a lot of those design build businesses. And if I was a client, I would do my homework and be extremely careful.
I know, and we come across a fair number of clients who are really convinced by this one-stop shop business model, and I get it. I understand the appeal, because it's like I just have one big payment to make. They take care of everything. Mm-hmm. They say they're good at it. They've done a bunch of homes in this neighborhood. Everyone says they did my home, so they're going to do mine as well. And I get, because everyone, if you're older and you're listening to this, you understand that whoever's at the top, their attitude, their preference, their expertise, their persona, their emotion, their personality, it all trickles down to the very bottom, right? And if you have someone at the very top who is not an expert in design and is maybe not as passionate about it as well, it affects the product 100%.
It does.
Yeah, go ahead.
And at the end of the day, it comes down to what you, the client, want. Yeah. Right. If you just want to get it done quickly and maybe do a kitchen that's kind of like different or funky, and you don't want to spend the money or the time or the process in working with an architect, then you might be fine with these people. If you're looking for something that's pushing the boundaries of design and that's super highly custom and that's extremely special, then you should go the other route. So
yeah, no, and there's definitely a bit of self-selecting here, sort of, right? If you are not interested in having a quality home or a quality office or whatever, office, you need an architect, but a quality home, let's say, then by all means, don't hire an architect. You can probably get away with the general contractor, and that's it. I mean, you're not going to end up with something that's nearly as comfortable. But, saying that, actually, I'm kind of shot myself in the foot, because I would also say that for almost any project of any scope, at least having a conversation with an architect is going to help you tremendously, because most architects are willing to have a chat with you for free or for some small consultation, cost amount, and it can really set you down the correct path or help you understand things better. I would do that. If you don't really know where to start or like who you need for your project, just
call an architect, call an interior designer, have a chat with them for 15 minutes about your project so you can understand like where you're at.
And so I think for me, the big takeaway from can I just use a contractor or do I have to have an architect conversation is that legally, yes, you can use a contractor for certain things, but they most 99% of the time, they do not have the skill set that's needed to create a building that feels good, that looks good, that is right. That's their expertise is execution. You know, it would be almost like, I don't know what, like you have car designers and you have people who build the cars, right? And obviously there's a lot of conversation between the two, but it would be like going to a mechanic and be like, okay, design me a car. It's like, what are the chances that the thing you design is going to be awesome and it's aerodynamic or
it's like,
whatever?
Technically on paper, I could do it because I have all the tools, I have the shop, I know cars really well.
Yeah.
But that's not really what I do.
It's different.
Right. And, you know, and depending on the builder too, a lot of them, they're very busy people. They don't really want to have to deal with you and your question and your small worry and your stress. They're not here to hold you and, you know, hold your hand along the way. Yeah. They're here to get shit done, right? Yeah. And you know, and if you need someone to hold your hand or guide you through or help you take the time or the thinking that you need, maybe working just with the builder isn't something that you should be doing. You know, maybe you need an extra person.
At the very least, if you have a project, really talk to an architect and they can help you figure out some of the nuances of these questions.
Have a list of like 5 basic questions. Give them a call for 15 minutes. If you need more time than that, you know, or if you ask them to come and see your house, don't expect it to be free. Like, you know, there is a lot of also people who kind of shop around trying to get some free advice from professionals. And you know, we don't do charity work.
Yeah. I mean, look, you know, have some integrity. But I do think that your point about a lot of contractors saying, "Oh, I have a designer in house," that's something everyone should take note and really, really listen for when they're talking to a builder, because
you should. And if they tell you they have a designer in house, well, you should ask to meet with that designer. Because that designer is the person who's going to design your house. Yeah. And that's the person you should directly interact with, not through a builder. And you should make sure that, and if you do that, then you're going to see clearly if this person is designing or if this person is just drafting, meaning doing technical drawings.
Yeah.
Drafting is a different job than design. And again,
drafting is, again, it falls in the realm of execution as opposed to critical thinking, creative thinking, and designing.
Drafting is being a technician of sort. Right. You know, designing is being more of the creative, not the artist, but, you know, there are different sides of the brain that don't necessarily have to work simultaneously. I
mean, so in this kind of these three parties, these three professionals, the interior designers and architects are kind of on one side and contractors are on another. I mean, same for, you know, interior designer, like you would hire an interior designer to obviously do design. Then you have to hire someone else to execute it, right? Like the guy who's going to do the millwork, the cabinet maker, or the guy who's going to install the new flooring or whatever. It would be the architect versus contractor thing we just talked about would be similar if you had an interior scope, you had an interior designer, you're just like, okay, I'm not going to use my interior designer to make any design decisions. I'm going to go to the millwork guy and the guy who installs the carpet and be like, okay, person who installs flooring, what do you think I should use for flooring? Does it look good? And he's going to be like, well, I've done this before, but this is not my job. I install, right? The same kind of thing applies to builders. Like the builders build, right? They do have some general sense of design after being around houses or homes or whatever so much, but that's not what they're trained in, right?
I mean, again, if you know the technical side and the creative sides are different muscles, you know, one might be bigger than the other depending on how much you train it, right? So.
Okay, so all that conversation, I think, sort of highlights some of the reasons for hiring an architect versus one of these other professionals to do the design portion of the work for sure and everything else. But there are certain even more specific reasons that you would hire an architect if you need to have one, right? So what I typically like to say is that there are the more pragmatic reasons that you would, the skill sets you would look for in an architect for a job. And then there's the more creative ones, right? The pragmatic being like to execute drafting, right, I need an architect to draw up plans. To draw up plans, not design a home or not design a building, to draw up plans. That's drafting, right? I need an architect for that. I need an architect to get a permit, right? Like, these things are much more pragmatic and much more, they're not creative reasons, right? Like, I just needed someone to do this thing for me, this well-defined task. That's different from hiring an architect and saying, I need a designer. I need someone who's creative, who is artistic, and they're going to create this beautiful building for me that does X, Y, and Z, that looks beautiful, that looks amazing, and feels a certain way, and yada, 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 right? Those are two very different things. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I mean, and on the latter, it's I need someone who can understand who I am, what I'm about, and what I want.
Yeah. Yeah.
On top of being creative. So you also have a little bit of people skills there,
So these are different, in some ways, different sides of the brain, we could say, let's say. And for some people, they don't need the kind of fancy design stuff. They just want something super basic, and they're looking for an architect to do drafting, permitting, construction coordination, right? And that's it. If you are a person who's at all, even just a little bit, interested in design and having a building that's better than just straight up like generic, you're going to want to find an architect that actually has creative and design skills.
But also to help you make the decisions.
Yeah.
Because, let's say you hired an architect just to get your building drawings in and your building permit done. Then you have your builder, and then you're the one who's going to select like your kitchen doors, the color of the paint for your bedroom. Fine, but like all of that stuff is on you to get it right.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like a good idea.
I mean, this is
unless you're really talented, you have very good eye and very good taste, and you're up for it. But
this is gets to another conversation, which is with the kind of the trick with this profession is that because it's visual, everyone has an opinion about it, and a lot of people tend to think they could do a decent job of designing a home or
because it's visual and it's about things that we understand,
right?
Like doors, handles, and.
But I will say that that's most of the time not accurate, and there are professionals for a reason. But my point is that there are architects. To be an architect just means that you have the license, right? And it takes a lot of work to get an architect's license, but if you have a license, an architect's license, then you are an architect. That does not necessarily mean that you are skilled at design. A lot of architects are skilled at design, yes, and there's some really great ones. But I don't want people thinking that if I hire an architect and their license, that means that they are good at design and I will get a great design from them. I wish that were the case. It's simply not the case, because the education, or rather the tests that you have to pass to get a license and the experience you have to gain is not really about designing beautiful things. It's just not. It's more about the, as I was calling it, pragmatic building stuff. Knowing the code, knowing the codes, knowing how construction works, knowing how coordination works, knowing a bit about engineering, knowing how to draft things properly, knowing how details work, construction details. It's that stuff. Because that's important. You can't mess up any of that. Okay, full stop. But the other side, which is equally important, there's no test to judge whether or not someone's good at design. So when you're hunting for an architect, you will find architects that are great at design and ones that are not, right? And if you are at all concerned about design, you need to be aware that they're different things. They're very different things.
I think that's maybe where, people don't think of hiring architects for, let's say, interior design work.
Yeah.
It's because in, the legality of things, you don't need an architect unless you need like very specific technical code-related things.
And therefore, that's the scope. And
therefore, that's what they do.
Right.
Which is
I don't know
pretty
when
silly
or
limitation
where.
to put us on, but
yeah. So again, going back and listening to the "What Does an Architect Do" recording will answer a lot of these. But so those are two different reasons to hire an architect, and a good office will be able to do both, obviously. But it's a distinction to be aware of because it's an important one. The other question that comes up is, do I need to hire a licensed architect?
Well,
there's a bit of a trick question.
It's a bit of a trick question. Thank you, David, for that. Very much appreciated.
Keeping you on your toes.
There is no unlicensed architect.
Oh, and pray tell, why are there no?
Someone who is telling you that they are an architect and they do not have a professional license, they just cannot call themselves an architect. Yeah. And I believe we talked about this in the previous recording as well, about, kind of like the educational background of architects, and the licensure is basically the final point of becoming an architect. Mm-hmm. So there is no unlicensed architect. That's what it is.
It's illegal for anybody to use the term architect anywhere in their professional title.
Architectural.
Yeah.
A designer that says I'm doing architectural design.
Yeah.
Technically, legally, they can't say that.
And so, again, not all licensed architects are great at design, but if you are going to hire an office for architectural work, architecture scope, and it's not just interiors, and let's say you find an office, you find their website, it's an interior design office, it seems mostly, but they say on there, we do interior design, architecture, whatever else, architectural design. Anytime you don't see just straight architecture, or there's the title of someone is not just architect or registered architect. If it's not architect or registered architect, they're probably not a licensed architect. Now, that doesn't mean they're not good at design, but anyone who's a licensed architect has done quite a few years of experience and the tests, and mostly because of the experience in education, that means they're skilled. They're more likely to be skilled at designing architecture than someone who hasn't gone through those steps.
No, for sure. And also, if you see that on a website and there is no licensed architect on there, they also tells you that they actually don't know that much about architecture and what they can do and cannot do. To a certain degree, it does depend on their background. See, what I'm saying is, like, if you're looking at an office and it seems like the makeup of the office, the founder, or maybe it's a two-person office and they're both interior design backgrounds and they're branching out into architecture, right? And they're saying we do architectural design and we're architectural designers. To me, that's a red flag because they're probably not licensed architects. And it's not just about them not taking exams, it's the whole education experience that they're lacking in that department. And again, it's a marketing trick.
It is. So even though getting a license doesn't mean you're a good designer, I will say that a quick kind of test, a filtering test, is that if someone is using these other architecturalness words and they don't come from an architect's background, very likely that they're not going to be very good at designing buildings. It's like, well, how do you?
It's very much likely that they put the word on the website for SEO purpose so you can find the office, but it's not really what they are known for. Therefore, it's a red flag to me.
Yeah. And again, we're not saying this to try and hate on other people, but I think clients and everyone else should have the information and know.
No, we're not hating on other people, but I think, like, we come from that background, and it's like saying, oh, I'm a surgeon, but actually I'm just a nurse and I do some stitching. There's a big gap there. So let's just call a fish,
Well, it's not fair to certain people. It's not fair to clients, like they should. And the unfortunate thing is we found a lot of clients actually, they hire a designer or builder or even an architect without doing much research, which that is what it is. But these are very different professions and skills. So there's that. I think the next thing is, very quickly, the subject of fees. So if you're looking to hire an architect, so you've decided now I need an architect. You've convinced me I need an architect. What can I expect in terms of fees?
Well, it really, really depends. There is several ways to do it. There's not really a standard by which, every office's work. It depends on the scope, the project, the office itself, and what they're comfortable with doing with their fee structure. The most popular one, I would say, are either like a fixed fee, like an agreed lump sum fixed amount, and that's what I'm going to charge you for all the services I'm going to provide you. And oftentimes, those services will be clearly listed in the contract because You can keep it open.
Yep.
You can just keep doing work if it wasn't agreed at the beginning. So that's that.
Yeah, sure. So okay. So the scope, right? That's important.
So you're redoing your bathroom, right? Well, I'm going to charge you $100 to redo your bathroom.
Wow.
I'm very generous. I'm very cheap.
Affordable.
I'm very affordable.
How big is the bathroom?
Well, within that $100, I'm going to pick the finishes.
X, Y,
I'm going to do drawings. I'm going to do this. I'm going to take you to showrooms. Blah,
so if I come to you and
right?
say, oh, by the way, I want to make the bathroom twice the size, and now I want to have a library attached to the bathroom for some reason.
Well, in my contract, the scope is listed. If this scope changes, the contract most likely will have to be revised.
Good.
You don't go to the dentist, ask for an implant, and come back and be like, I want 4 and expect the same price, right? That just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very focused on dental work right now.
Okay.
The other one is to do a percentage of construction. Yep. Meaning you're going to spend $500 on that bathroom, and I'm going to charge you, 5%, 10%, 20%, whatever my percentage is, right? Mm-hmm. So depending on how much you're going to spend, this is going to establish how much I'm going to make.
Percentage of construction cost is my fee.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And we'll kind of talk about each of these, I suppose. So one of the reasons why that is a good route for architects, frankly, is that if the scope grows, or not even the scope, so like in our bathroom example, right? If it's one bathroom and then now we're doing 2 bathrooms, well, then my fee gets adjusted because it's a percentage of how much you spend across the board.
Yeah, but that's the same thing if you do a fixed amount.
But what I was going to say is that the percentage of construction is also beneficial for architects because if the scope, meaning like the square footage in the program stays the same, but it evolves from being, like sometimes clients will say, I want like a really basic thing. I just want blah, 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 really basic. And you get into it and it becomes really detailed, like super custom. Everything has been gone over like 3 times. And usually when a project becomes more sophisticated in design, it becomes more sophisticated, or it costs more to construct. Usually we could say it becomes more custom. And so what happens is that even though the footprint and the program of that space, the bathroom is still whatever size it is, it still has just 2 sinks and a tub and a shower or whatever. Even though that all stays the same, right? Because construction costs goes up, the architect's fee goes up with it as well.
Yeah, this is good for the architect if you're talking about very expensive, very highly custom projects. If you're talking about mid-range, not really.
It depends.
And if you go the other way, if the bathroom gets downsized by half, but you've designed it the first time, the normal size, you're actually spending a ton of time on it, and you're making less money at the end.
Well, your fee would. This is getting too specific, but the fee would be based on the fair. So it's the fair market cost of construction. So some people will say, okay, so architect, if you're charging me a percentage of construction, okay, what I'm going to do is hire my cousin's cousin to build this thing for me, and my sister is going to be supplying me all the material, so I'm going to get it at half the price, so therefore your fee goes by half. Well, no. The amount that the architect makes in those contracts is based on the fair market construction price of what was to be constructed.
But that's not what I said. What I said is that if the bathroom is downsized by half its size, right, like you're revising the design, you're spending less money, but you have spent twice as much time, and you're making less.
But to be clear though, for if a client hires an architect and they're doing cost of construction, there's probably a clause in the contract that allows the architect to still get paid the correct amount in those situations, right? If the contract is written correctly, right? Anyway. So fixed fee, cost of construction, and these are roughly the first 2. And what's the third one?
The third fee structure is hourly. Which, if I'm the client, I'm thinking, all right, I'm just going to pay for the hours that you work on my project. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to pay any more. I'm not going to pay any less. That seems pretty fair. I'm just paying you how much you work on it. From the architect point of view, I think that's not ideal because, we're in a creative process, we're in a creative world, and you need to relax, but you kind of need to be free of some constraints in your head to fully dive into a project and its design. And if you're constantly looking at the clock and counting how many hours and thinking that my client's going to understand how many hours this took for me to come up with, how are they going to react to the bill I'm going to send them. It just adds stress to to a process that should be enjoyable and exciting. And as soon as you start putting a dollar sign on the actual amount of time that somebody spent, you can only do that if the person across the table understands exactly what it takes to do what you're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting, this hourly way of working, because on the one hand, I think most people assume it is ideal. Because in some ways, it's the most fair, right? I worked 8 hours a day. You pay me 8 hours worth of work. I work 12 hours. You pay me 12 hours of work. Maybe the last 4 you charge more, or whatever. But it's like fair in a sense. But that's theoretical, right? In reality, in practice, in architecture, it's really difficult because the amount of time that architects put into a project is, I would say, on average, easily 3 times more time, 3 times more than what the client thinks it is.
Yeah.
Always. And that people will be like 3 times. Yeah, right. I'm telling you, literally 3 times the amount, whatever the client thinks, that's what at a minimum the architect's going to put in. And so as a result, when you're doing an hourly rate, if the architect recorded all of their legitimate hours and sent it to the client, they would be like, what in the hell are you doing? Like, why are you burning through all these hours? Why does it cost this much money for you to design one room or design a facade or whatever? Yeah. And it's because the design, it's not, we're not accountants. We can't be doing like this all day and doing math and then, okay, that's it. It's not, the process is not linear. There's ebbs and flows. There's moments where you need to just sit and reflect and kind of take a pause. And those moments can be really, really valuable, right?
Or there's
even though
moments
no
where you
work is being produced.
With that, and there is moments where maybe there is, something that's a bit more difficult than to figure out because there is more component. But it doesn't seem difficult to you because when you look at it finished, you don't understand really how much it took to get there.
And that's what a lot of building is there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes, within the walls, within the envelope that no one sees, but is necessary for everything else on the exterior, of the home, or the exterior of the walls, let's say, to align, to look good, to be flush, to operate, with each other and whatever.
That, and then if you really want it to be fair in that hourly fee structure, then, certain hours will be worth more than others.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, sometimes you're just doing emails, like coordination emails with people. That's not the same thing as, maybe doing drafting or maybe designing, sketching something or 3D modeling or, having a meeting with your clients, right? Like those hours are worth different amounts. So, where do you draw the line? Like you said, you just end up being an accountant, like trying to keep track of every single penny, but at the same time trying to keep the process moving.
Yeah.
And it's just not a healthy design process.
So a lot of times contracts that where the fee is based on an hourly structure, there will be a maximum budget, that can be spent. Hourly with the asterisk of not to exceed this amount, guaranteed maximum price. And frankly, for a lot of practicing architects, hourly is like great for them, but there's always this weird thing of like fudging the hours to make sure that the client doesn't freak out. I've never come across an architect who upcharges a client. Architects, like 99.9% of them, when they do hourly, I guess it would be downcharge. They shave off a bunch of hours because they don't want to freak out the client.
But on the client side, a lot of them think that they're being charged more than maybe happened.
So for the client, it's like, well, that's a bonus, right? I'm getting extra work for like less money if they're shaving off hours. And, if I'm a client, I'm like, well, that's your own fault, professional architect. If you don't know how to run a business, that's not my deal. But in a creative project, you just don't want that kind of sensation in it, right? For anybody, it's just not good. So I think maybe we can talk more in depth about the pros and cons of each and why we would choose one or the other. But those are the 3. So you have fixed fee, it's easy. By the way, with all of these, with the first 2, there's going to be, what do you call it? I keep calling them add-ons because of recent things we've been doing, but they're not called additional services that happen. So if you ask the architect to do something outside of their scope, it'll be written down as an add service. But these are the three. So fixed fee, percentage of construction, and then hourly, right?
And sometimes some offices would do a hybrid fee structure, meaning that depending on the phases, they would charge you one way or the other.
I will also say though that there are some things, products and services where the more money you spend, that's a pretty good marker of what the quality of the service and product you're going to get, right?
Yeah.
Not always. Obviously, sometimes things are expensive and they're shit quality or shit design or whatever. But some instances that's the case. For architecture, I can't really say as a blanket statement that like the majority of the time, the more you spend, the better the architecture firm. There are definitely architects that cost more and they're worth it 100%. But there are also, and this is maybe actually a poor reflection of the profession, there are a lot of really good architects who charge so little they can barely live off of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's more of a discussion about the profession itself and one of the architecture community. But so for clients, right, if we're looking for an office, if they're dirt cheap, they are either a martyr and they're just donating their time, or they're not actually an architecture office. They're a drafting service. So that's something to be aware of for folks, because you get these people who are like, well, I can get it done for this month. This person says it's only costs this much money. It's like, well, they're not an architecture office. They're a drafting service. That's why it's so cheap,
Yeah, and I think the hourly fee could be okay if you're doing very specific tasks, like somebody's going to go survey your house, or you have like a first site meeting with an architect and you're just paying for the 2 hours they're going to be at your home looking at things. But that makes sense. You hired a freelancer to do like 2 floor plans for you. Yeah, hourly makes sense. Doing a full house on an hourly fee, to me, sounds nuts.
There are definitely a lot of architects listening who are like, well, that sounds ideal.
I would not accept it as an architect, and I would not do it as a client.
The issue is that with a building is such a long process. It's a journey. It's a process, and it's an emotional roller coaster journey you go through with yourself as an architect and with the client also by extension. And it as we discussed, the hourly, keeping track of like how much time did you spend here or there, it just creates a weird dynamic. And in a creative project, you don't want that. It's like hiring an artist to do a custom sculpture and saying, okay, I'm going to pay you by the hour. They'd be like, yeah, no. Yeah. Because I need freedom to do what I do and not be concerned about like tracking my time and having my time be approved by you. That's not my flow. I
think it puts both sides at ease when there is like at least a big number that we kind of all agreed on at the beginning. Either it's a percentage of the construction on an estimated construction cost, or it's a lump sum, but we kind of all know like what we're going toward.
Yeah, of course.
Instead of kind of like walking in the dark and hoping we make it,
And more on the side of hiring an architect should be able to help you understand some rough numbers with all of this stuff, because they've done projects before, so they have a certain way that they bill. But to be clear, we're also not saying that if an architect does one of these 3 fee structures, that they're a bad architect because they choose fixed fee, or because they choose percentage of construction, or because they choose hourly. It has nothing to do with their expertise and the skills that they have, right? But these are the 3 that are most common.
And again, it all really depends on the project and the scope of work. Mm-hmm. Like you're talking about a brand new construction of a home versus a tiny bathroom remodel. Like, one fee structure might make more sense than the other. So if you don't understand the fee structure, talk to your architect. If you wonder why this is better than the other, talk to your architect.
Yeah. Okay, so I've decided I need to hire an architect. I have an understanding of the different fee structures I can expect when I go out to find my architect. Now comes the question of actually finding the right architect. This could be a whole nother thing, but is it really important? And I want a nice building, right? I'm not interested in some just generic average thing that any person could do.
But you know what? I think a lot of people
yeah.
who get the average building, they actually think it's beautiful.
Okay, well, then we're going to exclude those people because they're not. They're ugly. You're right about that, by the way.
You know, like...
as an aside, the number of times that people say, "Isn't this nice?" I shake my head thinking... So here's a quick... So also, being that we are architects, people will ask us for our opinion of a house they just bought or their current house they live in. Like, oh, you're an architect. Why? I had the house remodeled just like not super recently, 5 years ago or whatever. Like, what do you think of it? I appreciate them asking because I love talking about architecture. I appreciate them asking because I assume that also means that they feel I can present some level of expertise and knowledge to them. I will never, ever insult someone's house if they're not going to fix it, if it's not going to be changed. If they just changed it and they ask me their opinion, I will only have good things to say about it. That's a warning to anybody who knows me and asks me about their house that they just did. Do not expect anything other than positivity from me.
From you? I don't know about that.
Is that honest?
If they
No.
ask me, I would be, do you want my honest answer? Or do you want my polite answer?
I won't do that because
I would ask because if they really want the truth, then I would give it to them. I appreciate people who want the truth. If they just want to get compliments, then I could do that too, but it won't be truthful.
Yeah. I usually say, yeah, are you happy? And they say, I'm happy. I said, all right. And then I walk away.
If I say, oh, it's interesting, it's not good. So if I ever say it's interesting to anyone, now that means it's not good. It's interesting.
So anyway, right.
So you were asking, where do I find an architect?
No, not where. I mean, there's a lot of places you can find an architect.
Street, sidewalk.
More of the question of where do you find an architect is Google, because Google search.
Just go to the office.
No, but like I had said before, I feel like a lot of clients will choose an architect or interior designer or decorator or builder, frankly, without much research, without a lot of looking around.
Yeah.
So the question is, how important is it really to have the right architect for a job? Because if you're licensed, you must be, you're licensed and you've been practicing for 10 years. You must be pretty good. You've done a bunch of projects. Your business is afloat. You're doing projects. Like, what can go wrong here?
So it's super important, but there is also different ways you can kind of like veto the person you are about to hire.
Veto.
Yeah. It is absolutely important that you find the right fit for you, for your projects, for your personality, for your expectations.
Yeah.
Right? Because again, it's like you're hiring an artist for a custom piece, for a one-off. You're commissioning someone to design your house. You don't want it to be okay. You don't want it to be fine. You want it to be what you want it to be, right? Like you want it to surprise you and provide you beyond your expectation and what you are imagining. That's what you're hiring professionals for. You're not hiring professionals to get it done. Or maybe you are. And that's fine, but that you should set your expectation and you should try to match your expectation with who you hire. Yeah,
so with the kind of delineator would be that, again, if you just want to get it done and you just need something kind of decent or below decent, just it needs to function. The same kind of person who's like, I don't need anything nice clothing-wise. I just need pants that are clean relatively and a shirt. I'm good. And that's my same attitude toward my home or this building. Then yes, any decent architect out there will probably be fine for you. But if you're at all a little more specific with what you want, and you are at all a little more engaged in design and interested in design and want something that's above decent, then yes, finding the right pairing is incredibly important. There are some instances where you hire an architect because of their portfolio and solely because of their portfolio.
Yeah.
Meaning to say,
you like the work.
This architect, to pick on a famous architect, Frank Gehry, he does a bunch of silver potato chip stuff. I want a silver potato chip building. Okay, well then, you ask him to basically replicate that, only mix it up a bit, right?
Yeah.
That's different. That's more like hiring an artist to do an art piece. You're not going to hire Richard Serra to do like, I don't know what, a collage sculpture made of plants. Like it's not going to do that. You're going to hire Richard Serra for a Richard Serra project, most likely. That's one kind of a one-off, not one-off, but that's a different scenario, right? Outside of that, the relationship that you have, the relationship you have with the architect is going to be half, if not more, of what dictates the quality of the final building in terms of not construction, in terms of the whole thing, design, construction, everything. More than half of that is going to be dictated by the relationship you have with the architect.
And we mentioned that at the beginning, you know, hiring an architect is also someone you hire for their people skill, meaning how the communication you're going to have with these people, how comfortable you feel talking to your architect, how reassuring your architect could be with you, how much you trust him or her doing what's best for you, right? You're not just buying a professional service, you're buying a relationship with a person for however amount of time this is going to need to be.
Yeah.
And you don't want to embark on that journey, on that very complex journey with someone that you don't really feel comfortable, or someone you hired just because you like the stuff on their website, but you've never met in person, or someone that meets your price range and seem to be doing okay work. Like you do have to do some homework before you hire an architect for yourself, for them, make sure that you don't wasting their time, and for the project, make sure it turns right.
Yeah. Most projects that either end up being really stressful or they don't turn out is because there's the wrong pairing from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And anyone who's lived, 30 plus years, you understand that. You've worked in a team before, a team setting. You know that the problems can be avoided at the very beginning and problems are caused at the very, very beginning. So that, I would say that pairing is probably the most important thing in any building project, right?
It's very important, and if it goes really well, like there could be magic happening. Like, you could both, the architect and yourself, like end up with something that went beyond what you could imagine you could do originally.
Yes, and that's the key. And that's one of the kind of confusing or different things about architecture compared to other stuff. And as we've said before, like architecture is not an off-the-shelf product, because when we go to design a building, we may have a rough sense of certain things, right? Rough sense of volume, because based on the zoning code, we can't go this high. A rough sense of program, like we're doing a gym as opposed to a home. But almost beyond that, it could be anything. It could be anything. And so what I like to say is, like, for clients, you can look at past work to have a certain understanding of quality and a rough understanding of style. If you want some like high valley, whatever, low valley house style, well, if the architect only does modern work, probably not a good fit. But so there's certain base stuff like that, right? But what I like to say is that for clients, you're not buying a product. And you're getting a service, yes, but it's more like you're paying for a relationship and a process, which go hand in hand, which will produce this thing, right? And if that relationship is not sound, the communication, like you said, if we don't have good communication, I don't know how this is going to work.
It's like, imagine, I don't know, you're hiring a painter to do your portrait.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, if you're being very, defensive or very cold with each other, portrait is going to come out a certain way, right? If you're being very intimate or amicable, it's going to come a different way. So it's a lot of our creation process comes from what we get from the client, the energy, the personality, the level of trust, but also the confidence we get when we talk to them about what they need. I think people underestimate how private and personal the conversation we have with clients about basically how do you live, how do you use your bathroom, what do you do in the morning, what's the last thing you do before you go to bed. Like, those are things that you probably even voiced ever to anyone because you're just doing it, but they're key things for us to understand how we can make it better, how we can make it different, how we can improve it, how we can make it personal to how you live and not someone else does.
Yeah, I think there's a perception that that the transaction is much more straightforward and clean, that, and that's how it works. And in certain cases, it can. It does depend on the project. Like if we're doing a vacation, I know we're talking about residential a lot, but if we're doing a vacation home, again, much less pressure on it, right? Like we can prioritize other things, and there's a little less conversing with the client because heck, they're only going to be there X number of days out of the year, right? And for sure, a good architect, there are fundamental space planning things that will guarantee that the building and the spaces will flow well, feel good, good proportions, and all of that stuff. But even then, it's that line of communication between client and architect, because if you don't have that, it can lead to problematic things. And we're going to go through a few scenarios that come up, during a lot of the client architect relationship that can make things stressful.
But so before that, let's say I think I found an architect, right? How can I make sure that they are right for me before I actually sign my contract and move on with the project?
First, you should talk to several architects, right? So you can have an understanding of what good and bad is. Like you can't judge if you've never done this before and you meet one architect. How would you possibly know, unless they're straight asshole? The second is like whether or not you can talk with them, and whether or not it seems like they're decent people to speak with and to converse with, and whether or not they're detailed. But I think in some instances, architecture offices will offer a consultation. And sometimes that consultation is just like a 1-hour meeting. Maybe that's enough for you to know, maybe not. And sometimes there are like short-term services they will do at the very beginning of the project. And that's kind of like a short-term contract. So let's work together for a little bit. And that contract is then done. And then afterwards, if you like what we've done together, actually not even what we've done, but you like the relationship and how this is flowing, then let's keep flowing. Let's just keep going. So the benefit of that short-term contract, let's say, honestly is not so much the work being produced, because it would be super preliminary, right? It's more about the rapport. And I like you. This feels comfortable. I like how you think. You seem nice. You seem fair. You do your stuff on time. I'm paying you on time. We can keep going. It's probably more about that than anything else. I
think another way too would be to reach out to previous clients of the architects you reach out to and see like, how did it go for them? Like, what do they have to say about the relationship they had with that person? Yeah. You would think that in order to hire the right architect, that they needed to have done exactly what you want before a bunch of times. But that's not the right way to find a good architect, I honestly. One, because there's this danger of just repeating old stuff, which I'm adamantly against. I think that's boring. I mean, if you want something that's been done a billion times before, then I'll go fine, do that. But why? Well, hire someone to do it for you.
But it's more about the architect's creativity, right? And the vibe they give off, and how they're able to think. So that's where I lost my train of thought now. But that's where it is more about how the process is going to work to get to that unknown outcome, right? Because that is what's going to dictate what happens in the end, not so much anything else. I mean, heck, some of the greatest buildings that were ever designed, those architects had never done that type of building before. Why are they great? Because of who they were, their process, how they thought, the relationship they had with the client, and also probably because they had not done that stuff before, they brought a different perspective, So hiring an architect, there are some basic, like pragmatic, like, are you licensed? Can you do good drawings? Can you coordinate with contractors? All that stuff, yeah. But there's also this kind of more X factor, wild card, like creative thing, right? That's the part that's more tricky and more difficult to find, but super important again, because you can have the greatest construction team, the greatest whatever execution team. If the design sucks, if the song sucks, you can have the best orchestra in the world. It's still going to be crappy. If you don't have a good script, your movie's going to suck, right? That's always the saying. It's the same thing. But so I had mentioned that there are a couple scenarios that occur. We hear about fairly often with other projects where clients become a little bit frustrated with the design process with architects, and we figured we'd talk about them quickly because we're burning up time. And a lot of these take place sometimes throughout the process, but more during the design phases, right?
Yeah, so more toward the beginning of a project.
Okay, so the first one is that the client thinks that they want something, a particular type of building, a particular thing, but after the designer draws it, the client realizes that that's not what they wanted.
Yeah, and I feel like that happens a lot. And that often happens a lot because the designer is going to try to directly respond to what people want and satisfy what they want. You know, like, that's what my client wants, I'm going to do that, and they're going to be happy.
Yeah.
But it's not really a design process that's led by the why should we be doing this. It's more like, this is what we should be doing.
Yeah.
You know, you're leading with the conclusion without searching for the question that led to that conclusion.
Nice.
Yeah.
Right. Totally.
And you would be surprised as a client, but also as architects, that a lot of clients respond really well to sometimes even going against what they came up with or what they thought they wanted, because they understood why maybe the other approach is better and more beneficial to what they're trying to get.
100%. If you're a client and you bother to pay the money, spend the money for an architect, right? Presumably you're hiring them for hopefully their design expertise and not just the other stuff. If I was a client, I want to be told when it's not a good idea, right? I'm hiring you. You're the expert. I'm paying you money. I'm paying you money to make sure it's good. I don't want a yes person, right? And so for both sides, it's not good. It's not good for the architect because what are you doing? Like, you're not designing, you're just being a yes man. For the client, not good. So if I'm a client and I have zero expertise in design and I tell the architect, I want this, I want that, I think I need this, and they come, and also let's say the things I'm requesting are not just generic, like, oh, I think I need a bathroom. Obviously you need a bathroom, but it's like, I want a bathroom that looks this shape, of this color, of this size. I want my home to have this kind of roof on it. I want my office building to be shaped this way. And then the architect does only that. That is a huge red flag. I'm sad to say, but it is. Like, if I were a client, I'd be like, I might back out of this because it sounds like I'm not
for a creative process.
I'm not getting
anymore.
my money's worth, right?
Yeah.
Because if I knew how to do it, I would just do it myself. I don't. I hired you to tell me what's wrong.
Yeah, it's like you go to the hairdresser and you're like, oh, I want to have my hair green and I want it to be cut this way. And they're like doing it and you actually look like crap after. It's like, you knew it wasn't going to turn well because my skin pigmentation is a right for the green color, and the shape of the cut that you give me doesn't work with the shape of my face.
Yeah, now you look like a carrot. Or
you know
broccoli.
No, but it's true. Like, you are investing time and money and trust into someone that has the knowledge and experience in telling you what is right and what is wrong for what you're looking for. Yeah,
so there's two things with that. I think the hairdresser analogy is great. Like I was saying, there's different architects with different the architects that are good at certain things and not good at others. Same thing with hairdressers. Some hairdressers I go to, and if I show them a picture of what I want, that's what I want. I don't want to fuck around here. Also, I am a designer, so I pride myself as being able to choose my own haircut. But if I go to a hairstylist and I acknowledge before I pay them, like, you're an expert, I want them to tell me like what looks good or bad. And I go there and I say, I want this. And they go, okay. And it looks bad afterwards. I'm going to be pissed. Right. So if you're going to someone because you want honest feedback, then you want honest feedback. So conversely, I mean, I would say, that if you come to the architect with a list of very specific things that you want and you say you need, and they come back with something different and they address why, the things you wanted or needed is actually not correct, that's a great thing. Because you want the architect, you want to use their vision to create something better than what you could have on your own.
Yeah.
Right? You want that friction.
And if as the client you had your wish list and like you're not going to change opinion no matter if it's right or wrong, then that architect is not for you. Then you need to find a yes man.
Yeah. And
It's a matter of matching, right? Like you can't force things.
At risk of putting off people, I would say that's just a bad client. Like then you
At that point, you probably don't need an architect. You know?
yeah, you need a draftsperson.
All right. Another scenario is, for example, the client has a vague idea of what they want, right? But they don't know exactly how to express it, and the designer therefore doesn't get it.
Yeah.
Right. So the designer is going to produce options, and the client just doesn't like any of them.
Right. This is very, 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 very common. And it's partially because of the nature of the work. Again, no one knows what's going to happen at the end of the project, what the project's going to be. There's a big question mark out there, right? So there's some kind of trial and error that's built into the process to a certain degree. I will say that very often I see it happening way too much and way more than it needs to happen. Now, why is this the case? Well, it's problematic. Why is it problematic? It's problematic because for the client, it can become frustrating.
Exhausting.
It can also become expensive if the architect is charging for it. And for the architect, it is also equally, if not more frustrating, and also can be expensive for the architect if you're absorbing the cost of redoing stuff.
Well, it's exhausting too. It kind of kills the mojo of the process. You know, it's like you're just retrying every time and you don't feel like you're making progress.
And we've talked about this before. There is a momentum and a life to the project and how it feels. And you need to keep the ship afloat. And what happens is when you have to repeat things too many times or something weird happens like that, things start to sink. The momentum gets lost and it's not good.
Frustration shows up. People get tired.
It's not good. You got to keep the pace. And that's actually a lot of what the architect does is kind of, not manipulate, but move things around gently, shift things so that everything stays kind of afloat. So creating a whole bunch of options, on the one hand, can sound great. Oh, we're exploring a bunch of different things, but there's a limit to that before the process gets kind of tainted or poisoned. And there's a limit to that, and there's problems because it is a waste of time at some point.
And oftentimes that comes around when maybe the research process at the very beginning wasn't really thoroughly done. Yeah. Meaning there is still some guesswork happening when some of the questions should have been answered during the research process. Yeah. The other thing could be that maybe the communication between the architect and the client isn't really well established. Like there is some kind of missing information between the two. Therefore, we just keep guessing, searching and guessing. Yeah.
Again, that's why in the very beginning, we try to get as much information as possible because we're going to use that to power the decision-making in the design process. Of course, there's a limit to that as well. You can't just sit down for 20 hours straight and download all the information from client to architect. It is, if we could do that somehow, that'd be great. It would solve a lot of problems, but we can't do that, right? And it takes time for people to reflect and think about what they actually want or why they need something. Or think, oh yeah, I forgot. Like there was this aspect of whatever space that's important. It is a process. It takes time because of the amount of decisions and aspects of a home or a building. But trying to front load it in a way as much as possible is beneficial because you avoid like this situation of just repeating things over and over and over again. And the communication aspect is also totally true. That's again why you need to hire the right person who gets you and you get them. And that's also why I always say, this is more of a tip for architects than anything else, is that usually when a client answers a question, there's several layers of information behind that answer that is probably more important than the answer they gave, right? And this applies to almost any conversation in the everyday format, right? And the architect really wants to know that deeper level of information. That's also why on here we talk about the why, the how, and the what as the layers, right? I don't want to know the what from the client. I don't want to know that they want this room to be red. I want to know why red. Then from that point, I'm going to find a better solution, or maybe red is the right solution. I don't know. But communication. So that's where the architect, they really has to be a good communicator, have good people skills. Because if I'm an architect and I'm talking to someone, a client, and they say something, if I'm not a good architect, and I go, okay, red, boom, I'm going to do red. or I misinterpret what you're saying. You know, I want a space for my family. And I go, okay, that means this. And I go off in this direction. Waste of time, right? Most often, the issues with a design, the problems with a design scheme that someone proposes are not really in the details of the design. It's more about fundamental things. The correct lane to go down was not chosen rather. So research, communication, 100%.
Yeah.
Okay, the third one is that the client doesn't know what they want until they see it, and the designer has to try and produce just a bunch of stuff until the client likes one, and then they just select it. Kind of like, just show me all the colors of the rainbow, then I will know which one I like.
This is probably the worst scenario, I feel, because it's like none of the client or the architect really knows what's best. You know, like the architect is just producing a whole bunch of stuff that sometimes is radically different from the other to tell you that, you know, within the design process, anything could be designed, right? But if as a professional, you're showing anything and everything to a client, well, you haven't done part of your job. Like part of our job is to selectively narrow down the best options. Like, you know, even if in-house you do 50 different options or something, you're not going to show that to your client. They need to be part of the process, but to a certain extent. You need to still be able to define which ones are the best, which ones aren't, which ones do you choose to show them.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult because first there's, again, some really broad decisions that have to be made. Like if an architect comes to you and they're showing like 50 options and they're all different styles,
and they're all great.
Maybe that's a process. I mean, that sounds like hugely expensive process. Maybe that's a process. I mean, for some things, there's going to be a lot of exploring at the very beginning, for sure. We're going to be all over the place because we're trying to figure out, like, you know, what direction we're trying to go with. And sometimes you can't just have a conversation to weed things out. You need a visual thing to work off of. But this is also where we live now in the age of the internet. Like having reference images is very helpful to get a rough understanding of the tastes and preferences of the person. And that's where, honestly, like when we speak with clients, it's also not just, okay, send in an email what you want, and then we're going to design off of that. We need to meet. I need to see you. I need to see what you're wearing, what your house is like now, how you speak, like what your interests are. And all of that in a very indirect kind of fuzzy way, like static, gets somehow channeled down into the decision-making that we have when we're designing. And that's what happens. We talk about it quite a bit. What is the precise, you know, step-by-step linear kind of path of that information going down, and how does it get channeled into decisions we make? Honestly, I can't say a lot of times, but it's there, and you can't, and that's how you kind of more greatly guarantee you're going to create something for somebody that has meaning and not be just way, way, way off the mark. You don't want to be way off the mark because it's a waste of time. The other danger of that exploration kind of like just produces a bunch of things and I'm just going to choose one is that you don't want it to be like, okay, let's go to, you know, Macy's or Saks or whatever. I'm going to show you all of them and you just choose the one you like.
Yeah, no, again, to me, like you're the professional, you should be selecting what you think is best and why it's best, and not just, you know, let it out in front of the client and let them pick whichever of the 50 options.
The last one, and these are all obviously variations on themselves, these scenarios. The last scenario is that the client wants a bunch of different things, and sometimes maybe they're even conflicting things, and the designer produces different options for each of those, right? But really the problem is that the client just doesn't know what they want and they don't know which direction is best, right? So I'm a client, I want this, I want red, blue, green, orange. And the designer produces red, blue, green, orange as different things, or maybe they shove them all into one thing and they say, okay, client, here are the things you
And that kind of goes back
one.
to the previous scenario where basically, you know, the designer is just there to execute.
Right.
And not guide or explain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the client doesn't know which one they want, it's because they don't understand which one is best or is worse than the other. And that's where we have to step in and explain those things and teach them, you know, how design and our brain works.
Yeah, and there are some times in some projects and some client architect relationships where it really is, I like that a lot, let's go with it. And for certain types of homes or buildings, it's fine. It can work. But for something that's going to, but most of the time that's not so great. Like you want a little more of a relationship or conversation, a dialogue to improve the thing itself.
To improve or even understand it and expand it onto other aspects of the project. You know, clients like, oh, I really love this room, like, you know, or this part of my house. Okay, well, it'd be helpful for me to understand why you like it and how you like it. So maybe we can use that same, you know, brain power for the other things we have to do.
And that also, like you were saying, like when clients aren't able to make decisions because they don't have the information to make the decision.
They need guidance. You're talking about things that they're not familiar with.
Right.
You know?
And that in some ways should be the case at some point because they are hiring someone else who has knowledge that they don't have. So, and yet they're being asked to make decisions about this thing. So they need input, right? It's probably not enough just to send something to someone and say like, what do you think? Yes or no? So depending on the client, it's part of the architect's job to clearly explain why one option is better and worse than another, the pros and cons of each of these options, right? And there are some cases where like two options will be equally good, frankly. And it's more about specific preference. But a lot of cases, majority of the cases, there's a clear winner. There's one that's better. And the architect should tell you this one is the best one for these reasons. And the reason should be not subjective. They should be objective, clear, logical, all that stuff. Now, I feel like that's part of the architect's job because that allows the client to make a decision, you know, with confidence and move forward. It also allows the architect in turn to know whether or not the client understands what we're doing, so then we can move forward, like you said, to other things.
Well, and again, I think it's also another way to build trust and confidence within that relationship because the client therefore understands why you think this option is better. It's not just you trying to push your agenda of which one you prefer. That's not what you're there for. Like they clearly understand that based on what you explain, yeah, this is definitely better for what they're looking to get.
Yeah.
You know, and I think clients really appreciate understanding the process and understanding like what it takes to, you know, understand what a good design is versus a less good design.
Yeah.
They're spending the money and they want to understand what they're getting into and what they're buying ultimately. Because when their friends are going to come over, they're going to be able to point things out and tell them like, oh, we did it this way. And at some point we looked at it the other way. Yeah. They also feel more part of the design process, you know.
I agree with that. There are, of course, some cases where the relationship is much more transactional. For
sure.
And that's fine. So like for us, for example, how much we, you know, reveal the inner workings of the process or the rationale behind something is dependent on the client, how much time they have,
if they're interested in it.
yada. Yeah. But a lot of times we find that people are interested for the reasons you mentioned. And, you know, we have to explain it. And I would say if you're a client and you're hiring architects, if you want to know why something's better than another, just ask. And if you're not satisfied, ask again. And if they can't give you an answer that makes sense to you, then yeah, it could be your fault. Maybe you're not understanding. But the architect should really be able to explain things, you know, in a way that makes sense.
It's very interesting too because, you know, clients always have kind of an emotional or gut reaction to the design options that they see, like kind of like the first spontaneous reaction. But oftentimes at the end of a presentation, they would ask us, like, which one do you think is your favorite? You know, like, you kind of explain to me the pros and cons of each option, but at the end of the day, like, which one would you go with? Yeah. And a lot of clients really not believe in that, but they're really interested in knowing, like, okay, as a designer, you know, which one was your favorite? And
oftentimes that initial gut reaction, it depends on the client, but sometimes we will allow it, and other times we won't. Yeah. It's more important for us to say our thing. Everyone has all information, then an informed response can be made. Now, in the scenario that you described, gut reaction, we're still going to talk about it,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah.
And a lot of times after we talk about it, they're like, oh, let's do that other way, because now they see it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's difficult for people to kind of see what we're talking about, but most often it's quite clear.
Well, and sometimes your gut reaction is uninformed, right? It's purely visual, emotional response, uneducated, completely like a virgin reaction to the thing that you're being shown. And as much as design is visual and subjective,
it's not subjective.
It's actually not subjective, because if you are educated on how you look at things, your outlook could change.
Yeah.
Yes,
I think that's totally true. And that's part of the fun, I think, working with clients, is that you get to see them like
change throughout the process.
You can see their thinking like, oh, okay. And they start to actually build on that knowledge throughout the project. And by the end, they have sometimes a pretty good sense of the principles of design, depending on the project and people and everything else. But that can happen. And a lot of people we come across, they like that. They want that because they have an interest in this stuff anyway. So I think that's really important. And I think that for a client, ask, why is this better than the other? And a really great thing to ask as a client, and a really great thing to say as an architect is, this is the best from the architect. This is the best one. I would do this one if it were my project, because for the client, you say, if this were your home, if this were your building, what would you do? Right? Because you will get the most honest response that way. And what I like about that question specifically is it takes off the pressure of, like sometimes it can feel like there's the client and what the client wants, and then there's what's objectively right, and that should trump what the client wants. And in that scenario, it's like, well, I'm the client. It's my house. It's my home. It's my building. I want this. I want to have it. And it becomes this kind of like versus my opinion versus what you're saying kind of thing. If you take the pressure off, you simply say, okay, but hypothetically, if this was yours, what would you do and why? Just tell me. Go for it, right? And it's for some architects that we've seen out there, they're hesitant to pull the trigger and say what they actually think. So if you're a client and you get that feeling from your architect, you get the feeling your architect's not being completely transparent with you because they don't want to offend or whatever, just ask them that question. If this was yours, what would you do? And then also for architects, it's the same thing.
And that goes back to, why, like what we were saying, why it's so crucial to have a good architect-client relationship is that, it's not just about, talking over the phone or like responding to invoices or whatever things. It's also during presentation and design process, feeling comfortable saying what you really think about the design that's being shown to you, and have your architect honestly telling you what they think is the best. You want honesty throughout the whole process, and that cannot happen if the relationship doesn't start well.
Yeah. I think that's a lot.
I think that's a lot. I think you'll have some good homework to do.
Okay, everybody, we're going to wrap this one up. Well, thank you for listening if you listened. Thank you for watching if you watched. You can support our show. If you liked this conversation, what we're doing in general, then you can support the show by leaving a review in the iTunes, it's not iTunes actually, the podcast Apple app, right? You can also find us on YouTube, where this will be posted, on Spotify as well, and a bunch of other podcast places. On YouTube, support the show by subscribing, leaving comments, liking, etc. And I think Spotify, you can only subscribe. There's
I think for now, I think that's it. We are on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can send us a DM. You can send us an email at hello@secondstudiopod.com. You also have a hotline. If you have any questions, any guest suggestions, any stories, anything you want to let us know, you can call or text.
Yep.
If you call it, it just goes to voicemail, so you don't be scared. We won't interact directly. The number is 213.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot it.
Yeah. 213-222-6950 is that number. And of course, our website is secondstudiopod.com. On there is all of the episodes and some other stuff. And this particular one, if you found it helpful, there's the Design Companion series, which is clearly listed on the website. And there's like half a dozen or so. There's maybe going to be a bunch more. Right now, there's about half a dozen episodes on there, I think. And they address some of these fundamental topics regarding buildings and architecture and stuff like that. So check that out.
And if you're curious about the other categories, and if you're not very familiar with this podcast, we also do interviews, fellow designers that are more tailored for architects, and some after-hour episode, which is basically just the two of us, having more casual conversations.
Yeah. Explicit conversations.
It's after hours.
That's called after hours for a reason.
For a reason. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye.
Bye-bye.